7:14 in the morning. My phone buzzed. Motion alert. I picked it up and watched a woman walk up my driveway with bolt cutters, cut the lock off my gate, pull a key from her jacket pocket, and climb behind the wheel of my dead son's Jeep. She adjusted the mirror, slow, comfortable, like she owned it. Her name was Greta Hollenbeck. She ran our HOA like a personal kingdom. She had paperwork in her bag she believed made this legal. She had 11 years of getting away with things, and not one person who'd ever made her pay for any of it. 6 minutes after she touched that lock, 6 minutes a joint task force from 3 law enforcement agencies showed up at her front door. What they found inside made the local news for a week. My name is Van Dakeroy, and this one's for everyone who's ever been pushed around by someone with just enough power to think they're untouchable. Where are you watching from tonight? Let's fill up the map in the comments. Let me back up and tell you who I am because it matters. I spent 31 years as a pipe fitter in industrial plants, scattered across Appalachian Kentucky, power stations, chemical refineries, paper mills, the kind of places that smell like burnt metal and machine grease, and where the ambient noise is loud enough to give you tinnitus by 40 if you're not careful about your ear protection. I was good at my job. I was the guy you called at 2 o'clock in the morning when something in the system failed and the whole operation was bleeding money by the minute. I didn't panic. I assessed. I acted. And I wrote it up afterward with clean handwriting. I retired at 58 with a modest pension, a bad left knee that predicts rain better than any meteorologist in the state, and enough savings to buy a small parcel of land in Crestwood Hollow, a subdivision about 40 minutes east of Louisville that had been carved out of old farmland. Sometime in the late 80s, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns are tidy and everyone waves from their driveway, but nobody actually knows each other's middle names. The house itself was nothing I'd put on a postcard. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch that needed work when I bought it, and a detached garage I immediately converted into a proper workshop. Pegboard walls, a good workbench, a table saw I'd owned for 20 years, and treated better than most people treat their cars. That workshop was where I went to think. Still is. I kept 2 vehicles, a 2019 Ford F-250, dark blue for hauling and errands, and a 1998 Jeep Wrangler, sand-colored, that had belonged to my son, Darnell. Darnell died 3 years before I moved to Crestwood Hollow, 34 years old. Cardiac event, the kind that comes without warning and leaves without explanation, and takes everything with it when it goes. He was healthy as far as anyone knew. He ran 5 miles 3 times a week. He ate well. He had a laugh that could fill a room from the hallway. And then one afternoon he was gone, and the world just kept turning like it hadn't noticed. The Jeep was the last thing of his I had that still smelled like him. His fishing rods were bungee corded to the roll bar, exactly where he'd left them after our last trip to Taylorsville Lake. His copy of a Merle Haggard live album on cassette, because Darnell was stubborn about certain things, was still in the tape deck. A pine tree air freshener dangled from the mirror, dried out and almost colorless, but still faintly sweet if you leaned in close enough. Every time I opened that garage, the smell hit me like a hand on my chest. Motor oil, cedar sawdust from my workbench, and underneath it all, that faint pine sweetness. I drove the Jeep twice a year. Darnell's birthday in April, and the anniversary of the day I lost him in September. Both times I drove it alone out to the lake and back with Merle Haggard on the tape deck and nobody in the passenger seat. I kept the Jeep behind a heavy padlocked gate on the side of the property, screened by a wooden privacy panel, so it wasn't visible from the street. Not because I was worried about theft, because I didn't want it looked at. I didn't want neighbors peering at it. I didn't want it to become the subject of anyone's opinions. It was mine, and it was Darnell's, and that was the full extent of who it belonged to. And then Greta Hollenbeck decided it was hers to deal with. Greta had been on the Crestwood Hollow HOA board for 11 years, and president for 7 of them. She was 63, always manicured, drove a white Lexus SUV, so clean it looked like it had never been driven on an actual road. She wore color-coordinated athletic visors to every community event, and communicated with residents in a tone that split the difference between kindergarten teacher and corrections officer. She had mastered the art of the warning letter, that particular genre of correspondence that manages to be polite in every individual word while being completely contemptuous in its overall meaning. 6 weeks after I moved in, one of those letters arrived. Certified mail return receipt. The HOA had determined via a vote I had received no notice of that. All non-passenger recreational vehicles stored visibly on residential lots were in violation of community standards. The letter cited a specific subsection of the CC and RS. That subsection, when I located it in the governing documents, had been amended just 11 days after I submitted my purchase paperwork, and the amendment was backdated to appear as though it had been in effect for months. I drove to Greta's house, vinyl-sided colonial flagpole out front, mailbox shaped like a rooster, because of course it was, and knocked on the door. She answered in gardening gloves and looked at me the way you oak at something you weren't expecting and don't particularly want. "The rules are the rules," she said. "You have 30 days to comply." Comply? How exactly? Remove the vehicle from the property or store it in a fully enclosed structure. There's a privacy screen on the gate. You can't see it from the street. The board has determined the screen is insufficient. She smiled pleasantly. "Have a wonderful evening, Mr. Screen, Delroy." The door closed. The weather-stripping seal made a firm, compressed sound. The sound of finality of someone who has never once been told no and has no mechanism for imagining it. That sound was the first note, and this was going to be a long song. I didn't fire back immediately. That's not how I operate. When a pipe fails at 2 in the morning, you don't start yelling at the pipe. You assess the system, you figure out the pressure points, the weak spots, the upstream causes. You find out exactly what you're dealing with before you put your hands on it. Same principle applies here. I filed a formal written objection with the HOA board, citing the backdated amendment and requesting a full copy of the original governing documents under Cookies Nonprofit Corporation Act. That statute gives members the legal right to inspect the records of any nonprofit organization they belong to, and an HOA is a nonprofit. I also sent a certified letter to the HOA's attorney of record, a man named Bradford Kimsey, out of Louisville, asking for clarification on the timeline of the amendment and the procedure by which it was passed. I didn't accuse anyone of anything in those letters. I just asked questions politely in writing with return receipt requested. Greta's response came 10 days later, and it wasn't a legal rebuttal. A legal rebuttal would have required engaging with the substance of what I raised, and engaging with substance was not how she operated. Instead, she dispatched the HOA's contracted landscaping company to conduct a survey of the shared greenway adjacent to my fence line. 3 men showed up in a rusted Chevy pickup that smelled of 2-stroke engine exhaust and fresh-cut grass, spent 4 hours measuring and staking, and then submitted a report to Greta claiming that 18 in of my fence were encroaching on HOA common land. This was the move. I want you to understand the architecture of it, because it was actually clever in a small, spiteful way. If she could establish an encroachment, she could compel me to move the fence. Moving the fence would expose the Jeep to full street visibility, which would trigger the vehicle violation, which would generate daily fines, which would eventually attach as a lien to my deed. She was trying to build a conveyor belt of consequences with the encroachment claim as the engine. I hired my own surveyor, Tanaka Land Services, out of Elizabethtown, stayed Elisicans for 32 years, a reputation for accuracy and for not flinching when HOA started making phone calls. The surveyor, a woman named Rosalind Tanaka, who wore steel-toed boots and kept her equipment calibrated to the millimeter, spent 2 hours on my property and handed me a certified plat map showing that my fence sat 7 in inside my own property line, not 18 and over the boundary, 7 in under it. I filed that counter-survey with the HOA board and with the county recorder office the same afternoon. Public record, permanent, time-stamped. Greta's landscaping report was now sitting in the same public file next to a certified document that called it wrong by 25 in. That's when I met Clifton Marsh, properly. Clifton lived 2 streets over, 71 years old, retired after 22 years as a paralegal, specializing in HOA and real estate disputes. His wife, Loretta, was the kind of woman who baked bread on Saturdays and knew everyone's business without being a gossip about it. She knew it because she paid attention and because people liked her enough to tell her things. Clifton had been watching Greta's operation for years and had never had a neighbor with the documentation or the patience to do anything about it. He showed up at my door one evening with a six-pack of escalated, that ginger soft drink they make down in Winchester, Kentucky, sweet and sharp at the same time, and sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours telling me things I needed to know. The most immediately useful thing he told me: Kentucky is a one-party consent state. That means you can legally record any conversation you are a party to without notifying the other person. He suggested I carry a small body-on audio recorder anytime I had an in-person interaction with Greta or any HOA representative. I ordered one online that evening. It cost $40. It would eventually be worth considerably more than that. Take away and write this one down. Before any dispute with an HOA or a neighbor escalates, look up your state's recording consent laws. One party or two party. It takes 5 minutes and it changes your options completely. About a week after the counter-survey, Greta called an emergency board meeting. The HOA bylaws required 5 business days written notice to all residents before any meeting. She gave 3. I found out through Clifton, who found out through Loretta, who found out through the walking group. I went anyway. Sat in the back row of the HOA meeting room, a beige carpeted space in the subdivision's clubhouse that smelled like old coffee and low-grade carpet adhesive, with my recorder running in my shirt pocket. The board voted without discussion and without giving me an opportunity to speak, to issue a formal fine schedule for the Jeep. $75 per day acrewing from the original notice date until the vehicle was removed or enclosed. I stood up when the vote was a no. Unsent, this meeting was improperly noticed. I said, the required notice period under your own bylaws is 5 business days. You gave 3. This vote is procedurally defective and legally invalid. Greta looked at me over the top of her reading glasses with the expression of someone who has heard many objections and found every one of them equally irrelevant. You're welcome to file a formal appeal, she said. The appeal fee is $250 payable in advance. I looked around the room. The other board members, 4 of them plus Greta, were arranged behind a folding table like a panel of judges. One of them, a man named Harwick Boone, who had the look of a retired school administrator, was studying his hands with great concentration. He was not comfortable. I filed that detail away. I paid no fine. I sent no appeal fee. I sent a letter instead citing the procedural defect in the notice period and stating clearly that any fines assessed under an invalidly convened vote were legally unenforceable. I copied Kimmy, the HOA attorney, on the letter. 2 weeks later, the fine notices stopped coming, not because Greta had given up, because Kimmy had apparently told her the procedural argument had real merit, and she needed to pause before she created additional liability. She paused, but she didn't stop. People like Greta Hollenbeck don't experience losing as information. They experience it as an obstacle, something to root around. So, when the legal pressure points closed off, she shifted to a different kind of pressure entirely, social. Over the course of about 2 weeks in late October, she made her rounds, unofficial visits to 4 of my closest neighbors, the kind where she stood on their porches in her color-coordinated visor and spoke in the concerned, lowered voice of someone who hated to bring this up, but felt she simply had to. She mentioned that the new resident on Maple T, Eris, had been causing issues. She worried about what it might mean for property values. She dropped hints, carefully unprovable but clearly intentional, about my background, my former occupation, my union affiliation. In a neighborhood that skewed toward small business owners and mid-level corporate management, the subtext of those hints was not subtle. She was trying to make me a problem before I could make her one. About 10 days into this campaign, a couple 2 doors down, Dale and Shirley Pruitt, a retired postal worker and a school librarian who'd lived in Crestwood Hollow for 9 years, filed a noise complaint against me with the county. The complaint alleged I was operating heavy machinery at unreasonable hours. I had a table saw in my workshop. I used it on weekend afternoons, occasionally on a weekday evening, if I was in the middle of a project. The county noise ordinance set the threshold at 65 dB between 7 a.m. and 1,000 p.m. My table saw at full operation ran about 92 dB at the blade and about 62 dB at a distance of 50 feet, which was roughly the distance to the Pruitt's house. I was within the ordinance. The complaint was investigated and dismissed within 2 weeks, but it created a paper record, and that was the point. I didn't find out the full story behind that complaint until Clifton's wife, Loretta, came home from her Tuesday morning walking group with information. Loretta walked with a rotating group of 8 or 9 women from the subdivision, and the Pute's daughter-in-law was sometimes among them. On a cold Tuesday morning, over the sound of gravel crunching underfoot and the smell of autumn leaves going soft and dark in the gutters, the full picture came out. The Putes were 3 months behind on their HOA dues. They'd had a hard year. Dale had needed a hip replacement. The recovery had been longer than expected. The medical bills had put them in a difficult position. Greta had been threatening a lien on their property, and then Greta had offered a deal, cooperate on some community standards enforcement matters, and she'd defer the lien proceedings indefinitely. The noise complaint against me had been their part of that deal. They hadn't wanted to do it. That was obvious from how Shirley Puett had looked when she answered the door, the one time I'd knocked. Guilty, and tired of being guilty and not sure what to do about it. I wasn't angry at the Puets. I was angry at the architecture of what Greta had built. She had found people in a vulnerable position and used their vulnerability as a tool. That's not neighborhood governance. That's something else entirely, and it has a name. Clifton and I sat at my kitchen table that Saturday. Black coffee, no sugar, a legal pad between us, and mapped out what we had: the backdated amendment, the defective fine vote, the coerced noise complaint, the pattern of selective enforcement that Harwick's body language at that board meeting had suggested but not yet confirmed. Clifton had spent more than 2 decades watching HOA boards operate, and he knew what the shape of this looked like. She's using fiduciary resources for personal purposes, he said. In a nonprofit, that's not just bad governance. That's potentially actionable. Kentucky nonprofit law requires board members to operate in the interest of the organization, not in their personal interest. Using the HOA's lien authority to coerce a neighbor into filing a false complaint against another resident wasn't HOA governance. It was a personal weapon deployed with HOA ammunition. That was a breach of fiduciary duty. And depending on how a prosecutor looked at it, it might be something more than that. Clifton knew an attorney in Louisville named Waverly Okafor, 37 years old, University of Louisville Law School, top of her class, spent her first decade building a reputation in HOA litigation that made insurance carriers take notice. She worked on contingency when the facts were strong enough. Clifton called her that afternoon. She agreed to meet. While that was being arranged, I started going door-to-door in Crestwood Hollow. Quietly, systematically, without any drama. I brought documents, the original governing documents, the backdated amendment, the survey results, the procedurally defective fine vote. I sat in 11 living rooms over 3 weekends and laid out what I knew. Some doors didn't open past the chain, but 7 households listened all the way through, and all 7 signed a petition requesting a special membership meeting to formally review the board's conduct. Under Kentucky's Nonprofit Corporation Act, members representing at least 10% of the voting membership can compel the board to convene a special meeting. 83 member households in Crestwood Hollow. 10% meant 9 households. I had 7 signed. I needed 2 more. On a Sunday evening, 2 weeks into the canvass, a knock came at my door. I opened it to find Harwick Boone standing on my porch, holding a Ziploc bag of peanut butter cookies and looking like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to put it down. "My wife made these," he said. "Can I come in?" He sat at the same kitchen table where Clifton and I had done our mapping. He drank a cup of coffee, and he talked for 90 minutes. He'd been on the board for 3 years. He'd gone along with things he shouldn't have, because he hadn't known what else to do, and because Greta made disagreement feel like a personal failing, but he'd kept records, not out of strategy, just out of an old school teacher's instinct to document. He had a manila folder of meeting notes, email printouts, and contract summaries that he set on the table between us like an offering. He scanned the petition. That was 9. Waverly Okafor's office smelled like legal pads and fresh coffee and the particular quiet competence of someone who has won enough cases to stop being nervous about new ones. She shook our hands, sat across from us with Harwick's folder and our documentation spread between us, and spent 45 minutes reading without saying much. Then she clicked her pen and started talking. "The backdated amendment is your cleanest issue," she said, "but it's not your most interesting one. The interesting one is this." She opened Harwick's folder to a section he tabbed, a running log he'd kept of enforcement actions, The board had taken over 3 years. Fines issued, notices sent, liens filed, and next to each action, the household it had been taken against. The pattern was visible once you saw it. Blue-collar households, retirees, people who worked in trades or service industries, or whose primary income was a pension or social security. Every significant enforcement action for 3 years had been directed at residents in that category. Meanwhile, violations by residents who were active in the local chamber of commerce or whose spouses served on county planning committees or who moved in the same social circles as Greta, those went unrest. Some of them were larger and more visible violations than anything I'd been cited for. Under the Fair Housing Act, Waverly said enforcing community rules in a pattern that disproportionately burdens residents based on their economic class or occupational background can constitute discriminatory housing practice. This data is not yet a proven case, but it is suggestive enough to file a complaint with the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights, which triggers a formal investigation. She paused. Let that land. We filed the complaint, she continued, and we simultaneously file a petition for special membership meeting 3 in time. Rough a certified process server. The board has 45 days to convene. We also begin preparing a motion for declaratory judgment on the amendment validity, and we preserve everything related to their surveillance camera installation. I asked her about the surveillance camera. She hadn't gotten there yet in her reading. About 10 days earlier, I'd noticed a new camera on the HOA-owned lamppost directly across from my gate, not a neighborhood security camera pointed at the street or the common areas. A pan-tilt zoom unit positioned to look directly into my property. I'd photographed it, identified the model, a Hikvision PTZ with 180 degrees horizontal sweep, and pulled up the county GIS map to confirm the lamppost sat within the HOA's easement. The problem, Waverly explained, was the angle. The camera captured not just my gate and the public-facing portion of my property, but a section of my interior yard that was not visible from any public vantage point. Kentucky law distinguishes between recording from a public vantage point, generally permissible, and recording private areas that would not otherwise be visible without the use of optical equipment. The latter can constitute unlawful surveillance. She sent a preservation letter to the HOA that afternoon. All footage, all installation contracts, all communications related to the camera preserved pending litigation. Takeaway: if any entity installs surveillance equipment aimed at your private property, your first call is to an attorney, not to the entity itself. The distinction between legal security monitoring and unlawful surveillance is narrow, state-specific, and worth knowing before you say anything on the record. All 3 filings went out that week. The fair housing complaint, the certified petition for special membership meeting, and Waverly's preservation letter. Greta received the petition documents on a Wednesday. Rinning Harwick, who still had his board email access, told me she was on the phone for close to an hour, her voice getting louder with each call. The 5th board member, a man named Rufus Clayman, who'd been her closest ally for years, went quiet on the board's email chain for 3 days straight. And then Greta made her decision. I think, looking back at it, that the preservation letter was the trigger. The moment she understood that her surveillance camera, the tool she'd installed to monitor me, was now itself under legal preservation and scrutiny, she concluded that whatever window she had to act was closing. She decided to force the issue before her position collapsed. She was going to take the Jeep physically, under color of HOA authority, and she was going to do it fast before any court had a chance to rule otherwise. She had a key made. I still don't know exactly when or how she got access to the original long enough to copy it. The lockbox where I kept the Jeep key was in my garage. The only time that garage had been unlocked and unoccupied that I could account for was during a plumbing inspection by the HOA's contracted vendor 6 weeks after I moved in, an inspection I'd been notified about with less than 24 hours' notice and hadn't been able to be present for. She'd been planning this since nearly the beginning. Here is where the story shifts. Not because of anything dramatic. No confrontation, no raised voices, no movie moment, just a document and a man with a legal pad and 2 cups of coffee going cold on my kitchen table. Clifton had been working through the full packet of governing documents that I'd obtained through the records request. All of them going back to the original Crestwood Hollow CC and RS from 1987. Most of it was routine easement descriptions, maintenance schedules, assessment procedures, standard HOA boilerplate, from a time when the development was first platted, and then he found Section 14B. Section 14B of the original covenants read in relevant part that any amendment to the governing documents required an affirmative vote of 2/3 of the full membership, not the board, the membership, every homeowner. A 2/3 supermajority of 83 households. The vehicle storage amendment that Greta had used as the legal foundation for everything she'd done to me, the fines, the encroachment claim, the compliance demands, had been passed by a 5-member board vote alone. No membership vote, no notice to homeowners, just 5 people at a table deciding to change the rules that governed everyone. Under Section 14B, that amendment had never been valid. Not technically flawed, void, legally non-existent, as in it never existed as a matter of law from the moment it was passed. I called Waverly from the kitchen table while Clifton sat across from me, holding the original document. She was quiet for a long moment after I explained what we'd found. "That's your declaratory judgment," she said. "Void ab initio, void from the beginning. We don't argue that it was improperly applied. We argue that it doesn't exist. Every fine, every action, every lien issued under that amendment is built on nothing. Void ab initio, Latin term, practical meaning. Everything Greta had done to me under that amendment had no legal foundation. That amendment had no legal foundation, and she wasn't the only one she'd done it to. 12 households in Crestwood Hollow had paid fines under that rule. Collectively, Waverly estimated somewhere around $34,000, all of it potentially subject to mandatory refund. But Clifton wasn't finished. He'd pulled the HOA's annual financial disclosures from the Kentucky Secretary of State's public database, filings that nonprofits are required to submit every year, and that any person with an internet connection can access. What he found in those filings made the V-hype. Amendment looked like a parking ticket, the HOA's reserve fund required by the governing documents to maintain a minimum balance of $80,000 for major repairs and infrastructure maintenance, currently held $11,400. 3 years ago it had been fully funded. The decline tracked almost exactly with Greta's re-election to her 4th consecutive term as president. The discretionary maintenance budget showed 41 separate withdrawals over 36 months, each one between $1,200 and $1,480. Not one withdrawal reached $1,500, the threshold that required co-authorization from a second board member. 41 withdrawals, 36 months, $1,340 total. Every single one calibrated to stay just below the authorization trigger, structuring the deliberate practice of breaking financial transactions into sub-threshold increments to avoid oversight. When it involves a bank account, it's a federal crime. When it involves a nonprofit's funds in a pattern of apparent self-dealing, it is potentially prosecutable fraud. Clifton knew what to call it. Waverly knew who to call. She had a contact at the Kentucky Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, a division that had received 2 prior complaints about the Crestwood Hollow HOA, neither of which had gained enough traction on its own to open a full investigation. They had traction now. The AG's office opened a formal multi-agency investigation within 48 hours of Waverly's call. I didn't know the full scope of it at the time. What I knew was that something larger than my dispute with Greta was now in motion, moving toward her from a direction she couldn't see. She, meanwhile, was moving toward my Jeep. The 10 days before everything happened were quiet on the surface. Underneath, they were the busiest 10 days of the whole thing. Waverly filed the motion for declaratory judgment in Jefferson County Circuit Court, a motion asking the court to formally rule that the vehicle amendment was void ab initio and had never had any legal effect. This was not a complicated legal argument. The language of Section 14B was unambiguous, and the record of how the amendment had been passed, board vote only, no membership notice, no membership vote, was equally unambiguous. Waverly expected a ruling within 60 days. The practical impact of a declaratory judgment once issued would extend far beyond my situation. Every enforcement action taken under that amendment against any Crestwood Hollow resident would be retroactively invalidated. Every fine collected would be subject to mandatory refund. Every lien attached to a deed under that rule would need to be released. 12 households, $34,000. People who had paid fines they couldn't afford because they didn't know the rule that generated those fines had no legal existence. Clifton, meanwhile, had turned his forensic spreadsheet into something that a court or a grand jury could actually use. Color-coded tab indexed, cross-referenced against board meeting minutes, vendor contracts, the HOA's own budget documents, and the public records from the Secretary of State's database. 41 rows, each one representing a withdrawal from the discretionary maintenance account, date, amount, pay where identifiable, corresponding board minutes, or in many cases, the absence of any corresponding board activity that would explain the expenditure. The column that showed the withdrawal amounts was particularly clear. Every number between $1,200 and $1,480. The column next to it showed the authorization threshold, $1,500. The gap between what she withdrew and what would have triggered oversight was never more than $300, never less than $20. The AG's investigative team had a copy of that spreadsheet by the end of the week. Here is something practical that I want anyone watching this to understand. HOA financial disclosures in Mo. States are public record filed annually with the state as part of nonprofit compliance requirements. In Kentucky, you can pull them up through the Secretary of State's online database in about 10 minutes. If your HOA's reserve fund doesn't match what the board is telling you, or if the budget numbers don't add up year over year, you have the legal right to request a full inspection of the books as a member. That single database search, free, public, available to anyone, is what cracked this case open. Remember that my contribution to the preparation was more physical, and I put it together in my workshop over the course of 3 evenings. The first component was a GPS tracker, a bouncy unit small enough to tuck behind the rear passenger side wheel well. Subscription runs $8 a month. I wired it to a constant power source so it would report location continuously, not just when the ignition was active. That way, if anyone moved the Jeep with a tow truck or rolled it in neutral, the tracker would still report. The second component was a dash camera with a shock sensor positioned on the interior windshield, angled to capture the full interior and both side windows. The shock sensor would trigger recording if anyone touched the vehicle hard enough to register vibration. I tested it by flicking the hood with 2 fingers. It triggered every time. The third component was the lock setup on the gate. I replaced the primary padlock with a high security shackle that would have required a much larger bolt cutter than the HOA's landscaping contractor had been photographed with. On the outer latch, the visible one, the one anyone approaching the gate would see first, I left the older, lighter lock, the decoy, the one that looked like the lock to cut. Then I called Sergeant Tyrell Abner at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Waverly had worked with him on a prior HOA fraud case and gave me his direct line. I reached him on the first try and spent 20 minutes explaining everything: the financial investigation, the surveillance camera, the coerced put complaint, and my assessment that Greta might attempt to take physical action against the Jeep before the special membership meeting, which was now 12 days away. Abner listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I can't park a cruiser outside your house indefinitely, but I can flag your address in the CAD system for priority response, and I'll make sure the dispatcher knows the context if a call comes in from your location." He also told me carefully, without saying more than he should, that the multi-agency task force connected to the financial investigation was moving toward a warrant, that the timeline was being accelerated, that certain things were close. How close? I asked. "Soon," he said. "Real soon. Just stay put and let us work." That night, the night before it happened, I sat on my porch in the dark and the cold October air, and I drank a cup of coffee, and I thought about Darnell. The air smelled like wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace and damp leaves and the faint sweetness of someone's dryer vent. It was the kind of autumn night that Kentucky does better than anywhere else I've ever been. Quiet, heavy with something you can't quite name. I thought about how a parking dispute had become a financial fraud investigation. I thought about 12 households who had paid fines they didn't owe. I thought about the Putes who'd been coerced into filing a false complaint because they were scared and vulnerable and didn't know what else to do. I thought about Darnell's Jeep sitting behind that gate with its fishing rods and its cassette tape and its dried-out pine tree air freshener. I went to bed at 10 o'clock. At 7:14 the next morning, my phone buzzed. The motion alert notification led me out of a light sleep, and I picked up the phone before I was fully awake. The camera app opened, and I watched on a foreign screen in the gray morning light of my bedroom as Greta Hollenbeck walked up my gravel driveway. She was wearing a beige windbreaker and khaki pants. She carried a pair of bolt cutters in her right hand, not the heavy-duty kind, the kind you get at a hardware store for cutting padlocks. Adequate for a standard shackle, but not enough for anything serious. She walked the way a person walks when they have convinced themselves they have every right to be where they are. No hesitation, no glancing over her shoulder, straight up the driveway like she was going to check the mail. The gravel crunched under her feet. That sound is audible on the recording. I know that crunch. I hear it every morning from my kitchen, every evening from my porch. Hearing it on that footage in that context did something to my chest that I'm not sure I have words for. It wasn't fear. It was something colder than fear. She reached the gate. She looked at the outer latch. She looked at the lock, the older, lighter one, the decoy, and she brought the bolt cutters up and cut it. It took her 2 attempts because she was angle fighting the shackle, but she got it. The gate swung open, then she reached into the zippered pocket of her windbreaker and pulled out a key, a copied key to Darnell's Jeep. I want to pause on that for a moment because I think it's the detail that changes the emotional texture of this whole story. She didn't just decide to take the Jeep that morning. She had planned it far enough in advance to obtain a copy of the key. She had been in proximity to the original long enough to have a copy made. I had run through the timeline of when that could have happened. The unattended HOA vendor inspection 6 weeks after I moved in was the only window that made sense. She had been planning this, or at least holding the option of it, for months. She walked to the driver's door. She unlocked it with the copied key. She got in. She adjusted the rearview mirror, the deliberate settling and gesture of someone making themselves comfortable, and she backed the Jeep out of the gate. I was already on the phone with 911 before I reached the front window. I reported a vehicle theft in progress. I gave the dispatcher the make, model, and color of the Jeep, a description of the operator, and the GPS coordinates that were already updating on my phone screen in real time. As the bouncy tracker reported the Jeep's position and movement, the dispatcher was efficient. I could hear the call going out on the background radio. Then I called Sergeant Abner's direct line. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what had just happened in about 30 seconds. There was a pause, not a long one, maybe 3 seconds. And then he said, "Don't go anywhere. Don't get in your truck. Don't follow her. Let us handle it." "I know," I said. I stood on my front porch in my work boots and my flannel shirt, coffee in hand, and I watched the street. I had done everything I could do. The tracker was reporting. The camera had the footage. The 911 call was active. Abner was moving. What I didn't know, what I only learned in full detail weeks later, was what was happening simultaneously 3/4 of a mile away. The multi-agency task force had been in a pre-dawn staging location since 6 a.m. that morning. They had a search warrant signed by a Jefferson County Circuit Court judge the previous afternoon authorizing the search and seizure of all HOA financial records at Greta's home address, her personal bank statements and electronic devices, all documentation related to the discretionary maintenance account, and any contracts or communications related to the surveillance camera, installation. They had planned to serve the warrant at 9 a.m., standard procedure for a residential search of this nature. When my 911 call dropped into the system and Abner's radio call followed it, 12 seconds later, the task force coordinator made a decision in about 30 seconds. They had a suspect in a stolen vehicle moving with a live GPS track. They had a warrant already signed. There was no legal or tactical reason to wait until 9. At 7:24 a.m., a Jefferson County patrol unit located the Jeep at the intersection of Maple Terrace and Route 44. Greta had driven it 4/10 of a mile. The officer activated his lights, pulled her over on the shoulder, and approached the window. She handed him a document, HO, a letterhead, printed and folded, asserting that the vehicle at this location had been impounded under HOA enforcement authority pursuant to applicable community standards regulations. The officer looked at the document. He looked at her. He said, "Ma'am, homeowners associations do not have impound authority in the state of Kentucky. That's not a thing. Please step out of the vehicle." At 7:33 a.m., 6 minutes and change after my GPS showed the Jeep start moving, the task force vehicles rolled to a stop in front of Greta Hollenbeck's vinyl-sided Colonial with the flagpole and the Rooster mailbox. They knocked, they announced, they served the warrant. while Greta sat in the back of a Jefferson County Sheriff's cruiser on the shoulder of Route 44, not yet formally arrested, but not going anywhere either. A team of investigators was working methodically through her house. The house was immaculate. I've been in a lot of homes over the years, and I can count on one hand the ones that were that organized. Color-coded storage bins labeled in neat block letters in the garage. Files arranged alphabetically in a 4-drawer cabinet in the home office. A desk so clear and ordered it looked like the background of a stock photo. Everything in its place, everything documented. Investigators, I would later be told, find this easier to work with than chaos. When a person of this temperament has been doing something wrong, they document it just as carefully as they document everything else. The organizational instinct doesn't turn itself off for the parts they'd rather keep hidden. The HOA financial files were in the lateral cabinet, 3rd drawer. The laptop on the desk had a password, but the warrant covered electronic devices, and the forensic unit had tools for that. What they found on the laptop once they got in was Greta's own spreadsheet, her personal tracking document for the discretionary maintenance account withdrawals. Each row had a date, an amount, and a notation column. Some notations were plausible. Camera, install, walkway repair, consult, irrigation assessment. Others were vague to the point of meaninglessness, and a significant number corresponded to dates when no board activity of any kind had been scheduled, and no vendor had submitted a corresponding invoice to the HOA's accounts payable file. She had kept meticulous records of her own misconduct. The investigators noted this with the particular professional appreciation of people who usually have to reconstruct a paper trail from fragments. Then they found the lockbox. It was in the bedroom closet, on the shelf above the hanging clothes, next to a stack of photo albums, a small gray combination lockbox, the kind sold at hardware stores for about $40, inside 14 property keys on labeled rings. Each label had an address, all addresses in Crestwood Hollow. Some were for houses, some were for vehicles. 3 were labeled with unit numbers that had no corresponding street addresses in the subdivision, suggesting they may have been for properties elsewhere. Next to the lockbox was a small spiral notebook, handwritten entries, names, addresses, notes, what appeared to be access schedules, and property-specific details for multiple homes, inspection windows, alarm codes in a few cases, notes about resident schedules. The notebook's existence was logged in the search inventory and referred to the AG's office for review under a separate investigative track. I cannot tell you where that track led because some of it is still under review as of this recording. What I can tell you is that Sergeant Abner called me that afternoon, and when he told me about the keys and the notebook, I sat down on my kitchen floor and I stayed there for a while. "How many properties?" I asked him. "We're still working through it," he said. Back at the station, Greta had asked for Bradford Kimmy, the HOA's attorney. Kimmy arrived, spoke with her privately for about 40 minutes, and then walked out of the conference room and asked to speak with the duty officer. He explained clearly and professionally that he represented the Crestwood Hollow Homeowners Association as an organization, not Greta Hollenbeck as an individual. His obligations ran to the organization. Her personal criminal exposure required her to retain separate counsel. He shook hands, collected his briefcase, and left. That moment, more than almost anything else, told Greta something she'd perhaps never fully understood before. The institution she had used as a weapon for 11 years did not belong to her. By 2 that afternoon, Harwick Boone had convened an emergency session of the board's remaining members, himself, Delbert Sprouse, and Norma Fott. 3 of 5, a quorum. Rufus Clayman, the 5th member and Greta's closest ally, was unreachable by phone or email, a condition that would persist for the next 48 hours until he resigned via brief message citing health concerns. The 3-member quorum voted unanimous to suspend Greta's board authority, freeze the discretionary maintenance account pending audit, and retain an independent HOA management company to oversee all financial operations until a full audit was complete. They also voted to formally notify the membership of the day's events via written communication, which Harwick drafted himself and sent out that evening. All of this by 4:00 p.m. On the same day she cut my lock. I drove to the Puitt house that afternoon. I knocked on the door. Shirley Puitt answered, and she'd been crying. I could see it in her face. She'd gotten the board's notification on her phone, and she'd seen the news alerts that were already circulating in the local neighborhood groups. Before she could say anything, I said, "I don't need an apology. I just want you to know that none of this was your fault, and you're not alone in it." She nodded. I left. That evening, my phone received messages from 31 people in Crestwood Hollow I had never spoken to. Every message said some version of the same thing. "Thank you." The special membership meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, 14 days after the search. Harwick had reserved the gymnasium at Crestwood Elementary School, the only space in the subdivision large enough to hold a full membership assembly, and had arranged seating for 80 people. 112 showed up. People stood 3 deep along the side walls. The principal opened the stage storage room and rolled out additional folding chairs that hadn't been used since a school assembly sometime the previous spring. The gymnasium smelled like floor wax and old wood, and the particular institutional warmth of a space that holds children 5 days a week, a smell that under different circumstances would have been entirely unremarkable. But that night felt almost like a rebuke to everything Greta had built. This was a community space. This was what a community space. This was what a community looked like when it decided to show up. Waverly presented first. I've watched a lot of people try to explain complex things to mixed audiences, engineers explaining systems failures, plant managers explaining regulatory violations, union reps explaining contract language. Most of them get lost in the complexity. Waverly didn't. She had a projector, a laser pointer, and the kind of economy of language that comes from knowing your material cold. She walked the room through the void amendment, what Section 14B required, what the board had done instead, what void AB initio meant in practical terms. She explained that every fine collected under that amendment across every household in the subdivision was potentially subject to mandatory court-ordered refund. She named the 12 households. She stated the collective total, $34,000. The room was quiet in a particular way during that part, the kind of quiet that happens when people are doing math. She then walked through the financial investigation, the reserve fund, the 41 withdrawals, the $51,000, the authorization threshold that had never once been crossed. She did not use the word embezzlement. She didn't need to. The structure of what she described made the word unnecessary. She closed by confirming that the Kentucky Attorney General's office had opened a formal criminal investigation, that the Jefferson County Commonwealth's attorney had been briefed, and that the civil recovery process for HOA funds was already underway. She did not editorialize once. The documents did all of that. Clifton presented the forensic spreadsheet projected large on the gymnasium's pulled-down screen, all 41 rows visible at once, the sub-threshold column glowing in its color-coded consistency. He walked through the methodology simply, how he'd cross-referenced the withdrawals against meeting minutes and vendor records, how he'd identified the entities with no corresponding authorized activity. He was 71 years old, and he stood at the front of that gymnasium with the quiet authority of a man who had spent a career doing exactly this kind of work and knew precisely what he was looking at. When he finished, and the slide stayed up, the room went completely silent for a moment. Then someone in the back, I never found out who, said quietly, but clearly, "My God." That was when Harwick nodded at me. I hadn't prepared anything. I stood up from my chair in the front row, walked to the standing microphone, and stood there for a second while the hum of the electronics settled. I talked about Darnell. I kept it short because I had to. I said that when I moved to Crestwood Hollow, I brought one thing with me that I was trying to protect, not from theft, not from vandalism, but from being touched by other people's ordinary carelessness. His Jeep, his rods, his tape, his air freshener, the last physical space that still held something of him. I said that when someone put bolt cutters on that gate and sat behind that wheel, they weren't enforcing a rule, they were trespassing on a grief that didn't belong to them. I said I wasn't angry anymore, I said I was tired, and I said I was glad it was over. The gymnasium was completely silent. Then Norma F. started clapping from her seat at the board table, and the room came apart. The formal mic drop came during the Q&A. Harwick stood and read, word by word, from a certified letter he'd received that afternoon from Jefferson County Circuit Court. The motion for declaratory judgment had been granted. The vehicle storage amendment was void ab initio. All fines collapsed under it by the Crestwood Hollow HOA were subject to mandatory refund within 90 days. The HOA board was ordered to provide written notice of the refund process to all affected households within 15 business days. He read it slow, every word. There were 12 people in that gymnasium who had paid those fines. I knew some of them by then, had met them going door to door, had sat in their living rooms. Some were elderly. Some had paid with money that had cost them something real to part with. I watched their faces while Harwick read. The shift that happens when something abstract becomes concrete, when a legal ruling becomes a check in the mail. 2 local TV news crews had been allowed in the back of the room. When Harwick finished, one of the reporters approached the board table and asked for a comment from Greta Hollenbeck. Greta was not in the room. She had not come. Her attorney had advised against it, presumably. Or perhaps she had simply finally understood that there was nothing left to say. Clifton, walking out beside me in the parking lot afterward, put it simply, first wise thing she's done in years. Outside, in the cold air under the amber glow of the parking lot, lights, the gymnasium emptied slowly. People stood in clusters, talking, exchanging numbers. Someone had brought a thermos of coffee. The gravel of the parking lot crunched underfoot as people moved from group to group. A woman I'd never met before. She'd moved in 2 years ago on the far side of the subdivision and had paid $450 in fines she hadn't understood. Found me at the edge of the parking lot and told me that she'd been afraid to push back because she'd thought it would only make things worse. I told her that's what Greta had been counting on, that it had worked on people for 11 years because nobody had known they weren't alone. I drove home in the Jeep, Merle Haggard on the tape deck, both hands on the wheel. 6 weeks after the gymnasium meeting, the Jefferson County Commonwealth's attorney filed formal charges against Greta Hollenbeck, second-degree theft for the Jeep, breach of fiduciary duty as a nonprofit officer, and criminal misappropriation of nonprofit funds. The last count, stemming from the structured withdrawals from the HOA reserve. She retained a private criminal defense attorney, entered a not guilty plea at arraignment, and the case moved into the discovery and pretrial phase where it would work its way through the system over the following months. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the criminal case was a clean, satisfying resolution, because the legal system doesn't move like a YouTube video. It moves slow. It has continuances and motions and scheduling conflicts and procedural requirements that have nothing to do with justice and everything to do with process. What I'll tell you is that the evidence was strong, the financial records were meticulous, and Waverly's civil case was in parallel motion the entire time. Rufus Clayman resigned from the board 9 days after the search, citing health concerns that no one in the neighborhood had previously been aware of. He was not criminally charged. The AG's review of records bearing his signature was, as of the last update I received, ongoing. The Independent, as several of the recipients posted about it on neighborhood social media. A few used the word miracle. That's an overstatement, but I understand the impulse behind it. I declined all media interviews. I gave one written statement to Waverly for use in the civil court filings. I accepted a handwritten card from Shirley Puit, written on pale blue stationery, with a floral border which I keep on the kitchen windowsill, between a jar of Darnell's fishing lures and a photograph of the two of us at Taylorsville Lake maybe 5 years before he passed. In the photograph, we're both squinting into the afternoon sun and not quite smiling, the way people look when they're actually happy and not performing it for the camera. Here's what I took away from all of this, and I want to say it plainly because it's the part that matters more than any of the legal details. Greta's operation ran on isolation. She picked people off one at a time. She kept every dispute private and individual. She used the complexity of HOA governance, the fine print, the procedural rules, the nonprofit statutes, all of it, to make residents feel like they were alone in a system they didn't understand and couldn't change. That feeling of isolation is not an accident. It's a strategy, and it works right up until the moment when people start talking to each other. What beat her was 11 households, a retired paralegal and his walking group wife, a board member who showed up with cookies and a folder, an attorney who took the case on contingency, a police sergeant who flagged an address. None of us had resources that were unusual. We had time, we had documentation, and we had each other. That was enough. 6 months after the gymnasium meeting, Harwick announced at a regular board session that the HOA was establishing the Darnell Diacroix Community Assistance Fund, seeded with $5,000 from the civil recovery proceeds administered by a rotating 3-resident committee with fully transparent quarterly financials published online. The purpose: short-term financial assistance for Crestwood Hollow residents facing HOA-related hardship, so that no one else would find themselves in the position the Pute had been in, so that vulnerability wouldn't be a lever anymore. It's a small fund. It won't make headlines, but it changes what's possible for the people it reaches, and that's the kind of thing that matters from the inside. The Jeep is still in the garage. The lock is new. The gate is new. The cassette tape is still in the deck. I drive it on Darnell's birthday and on the anniversary, and sometimes now, not often, but sometimes, I drive it to Clifton and Loretta's house on a Sunday afternoon. And son, D, we sit on their porch and drink coffee and talk about something that has nothing to do with any of this. That's the part that doesn't make the news either, the part where things go quiet and normal and good. I'll take it. You know what I keep coming back to. Not the task force, not the crossroom. It's Van driving home in that chip. Merhug on the tape deck. Nobody else in the car. That's the part nobody films. He wasn't a lawyer, wasn't connected, just a retired pie with a bad knee. And one thing he was trying to keep sick, and a woman who's run his neighborhood for 11 years decided that thing was her to deal with. $51,000 gone from a fund that was supported to protect everyone first because somebody finally pulled a public database and sat down and read it. That's how small power survives, not because it's strong, because we are busy. So let me ask you, when is your last look at your HOA financer? Do you even know if your state makes the public? Drop your story in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe if you need to see what's next, because the next one involves a false easement and a doorbell camera that caught everything. And remember what Vaughn proved. The most dangerous man in the room isn't the loudest, is the one keeping records.